Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
So much is happening so quickly to the National Park Service. There have been staff reductions, hiring freezes, spending freezes, orders from the Interior Secretary to make sure visitors find national parks welcoming no matter what it takes. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Every week seems to bring something new, and quite frankly, dire, to the National Park Service. Most recently, we've heard about the loss of about 60 employees from the agency's Alaska regional office, and there are concerns the Trump administration is going to push through even greater reductions in force for the Park Service. How are those moves impacting the parks and the Park Service? My guest today is Kristen Brengel, the Senior Vice President for Governmental Affairs at the National Parks Conservation Association. We'll be back in a minute with Kristen to discuss the latest news involving the parks.
Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Hi, Kristen. Welcome back to The Traveler.
Hey, Kurt. Good to see you.
Never a lack of news from the National Park System and from the Interior Department, and I'm not exactly sure where to start, so why don't we just dive in. Most recently, as NPCA reported, and the Traveler is doing our own reporting to deepen the story, Alaska's regional office had roughly 60 employees let go the other week. And as I understand, there was only about 250 employees in the regional office. And we're talking chief of aviation, the chief ranger for the region.
Concessions, yeah.
Archaeology. What's this going to do to the National Park Service operations in Alaska, especially if somehow the administration gets approval to go forward with the reduction in force, which, as I understand it, a federal judge has put a hold on that, but administration doesn't seem to care about what federal judges do.
Right. Well, we got our hands on a staff list for the Alaska Regional Office a couple of weeks ago, and we compared it to the staff directory from 2024, and that's how we started to peel away the layers and understand who was let go, what were they doing there, how did they contribute to the individual park management? And you know this as well as I do, Kurt, that the Alaska Regional Office covers more terrain than any other regional office of the Park Service. And the regional office there carries the weight of so much natural and cultural resource protection, as well as basics of aviation management, fire management, concessions management. They do so much for all of the park units out in Alaska, and they really serve them. And it was amazing to see the amount of people who had left because they were pushed out over the last 4 months, and then how many people are now doing the jobs of those people. Like you were saying, there's sort of one woman doing tribal engagement that used to be the work of 4 or 5 staff people. There's fewer concessions people, and you and I both know in Alaska, the cruise ship industry, there's so many industries that are so dependent on those parks to make their income. So it's just a great emblematic example of what happens when you just keep pushing people out. And the thing that's irritating to me and to us here at NPCA is that Secretary Burgum keeps talking about regional offices as if they're expendable. And Alaska has 60% of our national park system lands. None of these people were expendable. They were not too many people leaning on the bureaucracy. These were all needed staff positions that now fewer people have to do. And so it's going to make the Park Service far less efficient in Alaska. And at this point, though, Kurt, this is the only regional office where we have this kind of data for. We're assuming this is widespread around the country.
As I've heard, 7 of the 8 leadership team in the regional office was let go, forced out, whatever you want to call it. And, the ramifications are huge because obviously what happens on national park lands in Alaska also affects, wildlife on state lands and whatnot. But again, aviation lead, you get rid of the aviation lead, you have to fly to get around Alaska. Glacier Bay, as you mentioned, huge tour ship industry. The Park Service does a very thorough job in monitoring those cruise ships and how fast they're going, what are they dumping into Glacier Bay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do we know what's going to happen as far as those crucial positions?
Well, there's a hiring freeze. Remember, President Trump extended the original hiring freeze another 90 days. So we're looking at July for the deadline for the next hiring freeze, but we're expecting them to just re-up it. So there's no end in sight of these staff reductions and how they're going to affect these park units and all of the people, who are attached to the Park Service because they need to work with them in order to facilitate their use. I think the other thing that we're concerned about, especially in Alaska, but this goes for the rest of the country, is the amount of inventory and monitoring that goes on in Alaska. So many of our friends, our mutual friends, Kurt, talk to us about how the environment in Alaska is changing rapidly, how tundra land is now becoming forested, just all of these changing dynamics and how Alaska is getting more susceptible to landslides. Well, there's an ongoing landslide study in Alaska, and if Burgum and DOI continue along the path with the RIF at some point in time, they're talking about wiping out the entire inventory and monitoring program in the Park Service. So for Alaska, that's life and death. If you stop studying landslides, if you stop studying the effects of climate change in those national parks, you can start putting people in danger. And one example that you and I are utterly familiar with, and so many others are, is the Denali Road. That road just kept having issues at Polychrome Pass. Now they're rebuilding it and they're putting like a bridge structure on it or so on and so forth. But that's from the sensitivity of this landscape. And if you stop studying it and you stop monitoring it, you're going to put people in danger. So this whole concept of pushing staff out of the Park Service, of saying we don't need regional staff, we don't need inventory and monitoring, we don't need natural and resource experts, we're just going to be visitor services, that's not going to cut it. And Alaska is a great example of an area of the park system where the moves that they have made already are so bad for the Park Service out there and could, and a RIF on top of it, if they ever are able to go through with it, will be so problematic for Alaska and could actually put people in danger.
There's that saying about the story unravels much like when you peel an onion, layer after layer after layer, and climate change inventory and monitoring. You mentioned Polychrome Road. This past week, a fire was spotted in Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve. It's getting drier. It's getting hotter up there. I don't know if this fire was totally unusual, but nevertheless, we're seeing fires. Visitor safety. We're heading into the peak climbing season at Denali National Park. Are there going to be enough rangers to respond, mountaineering rangers to respond to climbers in need? All kinds of crazy stuff. And then if you run down the regional staff, do you run into some parks that don't attract a lot of visitation, and so you pull the resources out of there to fill in someplace else, and then you might decide, well, geez, maybe we should give this to the state of Alaska to operate. Is that something on your radar? Is that something you're concerned about?
Something I'm very concerned about, and I thought Senator Murkowski, during the hearing in the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee last week, did an excellent job. She raised this issue of, I'm paraphrasing, hey, a lot of my parks don't have heavy visitation, so if you're using that as a criteria, that's a problem for me. So she said that to Burgum last week, and she was pretty clear that she doesn't think the federal standard and the state standard are similar enough when it comes to our national park units. Of course, Burgum, sitting there with the chairman of the committee, is going to say that the parks in Alaska are not going to be touched. But yes, what is clear to me after watching Secretary Burgum last week at those committee hearings is that he is not committed at all to the park units that don't have an N and a P at the end of them. And he repeated this, which is what we saw in the president's budget that was released a couple of weeks ago. When the Secretary of Interior is telling Congress that he's going to only take care of the crown jewels, which are the 63 national parks, not the battlefields, not the seashores, not the preserves, not the recreation areas, not the military parks, historical parks. When he's saying that there are only 63 of the 433 park units that he's going to care about, that puts all of the other park units in jeopardy. And that means they're going to make decisions like you're talking about as a hypothetical, Kurt. They're going to take people from these other park units and put them in the places where they want them. And then those park units will suffer from staff shortages and other problems because of it. So I think I said this to you in an article that you wrote last week. If Burgum was not going to manage and steward the other park units, he should have been honest with Congress when he was being nominated. But there are 433 park units that he is supposed to steward, and if he is not committed to that, Congress needs to hold him accountable for it. As you know as well as I do, there are so many park units that are just beloved by so many people around the country and for different reasons. And there are certainly constituencies of people who care maybe more about a specific park unit. Growing up in New Jersey, we all went to the Statue of Liberty a couple of times on school field trips. So yes, the students from New Jersey and New York tend to beef up the numbers in the Statue of Liberty. But Statue of Liberty means so much to so many people, but it's a national monument. It's not an NP park. Gettysburg is a military park. It's not an NP national park. And so there's so many places that we love and cherish around this country and want them preserved for their stories. And as you know, there are park units that people see maybe in a National Geographic show, but they're not familiar with the site itself, like a Bandelier, where people can, take ladders up into cliff dwellings. When folks get to New Mexico and they know that they can see a place like that, they love going there. And they love knowing that it's protected. And I think Burgum is underestimating how much the public and Congress love these places.
Well, let me ask you, we heard that they were going to focus staff cuts in the regional offices and in the Washington office. Do you think they picked Alaska first because Governor Mike Dunleavy wants the Park Service out of Alaska? He wrote a letter to President-elect Trump back in, I think it was December. He said, I want the Ambler Road permitted through Gates of the Arctic. I want state control over fish and wildlife within National Park System units. get rid of the National Park Service's practice of managing lands eligible for wilderness as official wilderness. I mean, he wrote the map on what the Trump administration should be doing.
Just to be clear, the reason that we had the information from Alaska is because someone gave it to us. It wasn't necessarily a focal point from DOI. It was just, this is the first time we've been able to get actual data on a regional office, but I do believe the other regional offices have been gutted as well. I just don't have the data for it. So Alaska happened to be the place where I got some data from some current staff people there. So I just want to be clear about that. But I do think Alaska is being targeted. And I do think the long list of issues that you just talked about, whether it's mining or oil and gas drilling, I think that Alaska is very much threatened. And I think that the more Burgum talks in front of Congress, the more I'm worried that he doesn't really care about the conservation value of these places as much as you and I do, and everyone who listens to this podcast. So I think we do need to be concerned that even though we know that Gates of the Arctic is one of the most beautiful places on Earth, that Burgum may not value it. And so building a mining road through it is something that he thinks makes sense on his balance sheet that he keeps talking about, and that we can sacrifice parks for industry. And so I think people should be very concerned about that. And I think Alaska is going to be a hot spot where the congressional delegation is going to have to draw a line in the sand.
Yeah, we're going to see if that's going to happen. A story that the Traveler had this past week was the fact that the administration so far has just presented a skinny budget to Congress as far as how they want to fund the government. And some concerns were brought to our attention that if somehow the Trump administration can convince Congress to give them a blank check, basically, here's the money and we don't care where you're going to spend it, that opens up some problems too for the Park Service, right? I mean, Burgum could decide that, I don't care about the Statue of Liberty. New York and New Jersey can take care of that, so I'm going to take their budget and put it someplace else.
Yeah, I think Congress clearly can't do that. They can't leave it to the administration to get a lump sum of money and decide where to spend it. I think at this point, Burgum has said and done nothing to provide the confidence that he knows how to manage these places. And because there are so many units of the Park Service, what's amazing, Kurt, is that when you look at the previous years and you look at how much funding is needed to keep a recreation area running or Blue Ridge Parkway, these units of the Park Service can be very expensive because of the amount of visitation that they get. And some of these parks have so much law enforcement and search and rescue needs that they just need much bigger budgets than other park units. And so if members of Congress have to start fighting over the budget of some of these park units with Burgum, they're just not going to want to do it. So they're going to insist on having a budget that breaks out each park unit and make sure that everyone's still getting their line items. Because what you find when you look at the individual park unit budgets is that not all of the NP parks have the most funding. Many, many times over, it's a recreation area or a different type of park unit that has been getting more appropriated dollars because of the visitation. So the math doesn't work out for Burgum on that.
I was really surprised during that Appropriations Committee hearing when Senator Merkley kind of pushed Secretary Burgum about line item explanations for how they were going to spend their money. And the senator asked the Interior Secretary, is OMB holding up the money? And Burgum said yes. The paperwork as far as how much money he'd have to play with, so to speak. What struck me was the secretary did not say, but don't worry, we're going to get you those line item information details that you asked for. How closely is Congress paying attention to what's going on with Interior? I mean, there's so much going on across the federal government. The Trump administration came in with a plan. They were going to flood the zone, so to speak, with so many actions, executive orders going on. Can Congress possibly focus on one area like Interior and the impacts that it's having?
Congress has been flooded, and I'm up on Capitol Hill almost every week if I'm not having a medical issue or something like that. So Congress, if you go up to Capitol Hill, it's flooded with all sorts of people who've had their funding held up, paused, canceled. The tariff, all the people who were lobbying on tariffs. For the first few weeks of Congress this year, it was very, very hard to get a meeting up on Capitol Hill. But luckily, when it comes to national parks, a lot of the staff people who work on appropriations for Park Service are longtime staff people. They have a vested interest in making sure that parks are well funded, and they're very much on top of what's going on, and they're making inquiries to the administration every day. And so Merkley's phenomenal staff people, who are absolutely on top of everything, have been asking for this information for months from the administration and have not gotten any. And what's interesting is, I think even Senator Murkowski opened up the hearing by saying, "Who do I call?" We used to have a bat phone where we could call over to Interior and get our questions answered. Nothing gets answered. And I think she even brought up the name Tyler Hassan, who is the culprit of downsizing and consolidating. And he apparently is the person who's reading every contract over $50,000, and it's up to him whether or not it gets approved. If I were a member of Congress, I would be so pissed right now, because you have a person who is illegally in a position, who's openly violating the Vacancies Act, who is in charge of all of this stuff and holding up money for your constituents, and trying to figure out how to downsize the Park Service, the most beloved institution in the federal government. And it's all this bottleneck of this one guy who's an oil executive from Texas who doesn't know park management if it bit him, and yet no one can get through to him or Burgum. No one can ask what's going on with their lease or their grant or funding for historical preservation. This guy is even holding up contracts for Great American Outdoors Act projects. And so Congress sees this bottleneck, and they brought it up during these hearings that this is what they're hearing. And the funny thing is that Burgum kept talking about how he needs 16 political appointees. Well, guess who hasn't appointed these people? President Trump. And so there's no Park Service nominee, there's no BLM nominee right now. That's because of the White House, not because of Congress. But that's all the redirecting that occurred last week with Burgum in Congress, is that he's making it seem like Congress is holding up his nominees. They haven't even been nominated. What is he even talking about? Which, honestly, this kind of redirecting that he's doing right now just shows how little confidence Congress can have in him to run these places.
Well, I think I have to push back a little bit, Kristen. In the House, the Republicans, with that robust majority of 3 or 4 positions, our congressman is all on board with the cuts to the Park Service. He thinks it's the greatest thing that's happened in terms of the great One Beautiful Bill Act and what it does. Our senators, well, Mike Lee's one of our senators. He's probably wants to cut even more. But, I just haven't seen any real pushback from Congress. I mean, sure, they might question the secretaries during a committee hearing, but, where's the teeth of Congress to claw some of this back?
Yeah, I agree with you that I wish Congress would be more, put their foot down more and hold the administration more accountable. I have to say, you and I joke around about how old we are. Of course, you're old.
You're young.
You're older than me, but I've been around for a while, a couple decades. And
youngster.
When I do the math on it, I've been in DC for 26 years, and then before that, I was lobbying in New Jersey. So it's been a minute that I've been here. No one ever saw anything like this coming. And I know folks say, well, all you had to do is read Project 2025. No one could have guessed how awful and cruel this administration would be when it comes to the Park Service and other agencies. It was somewhat in Project 2025, and even we were preparing for downsizing the federal workforce. But I think the actions that they took were sort of unprecedented, and no one was ready for it. So I think it threw Congress off guard. I think the confusion and the amount of glass breaking that occurred was unusual, but I think Congress has also gotten away with making phone calls and trying to figure out what's going on, but not actually doing something. So I think this appropriations process that's happening is going to be the forum in which they can't avoid these conversations and this accountability with the administration. So I would say to people, if you're watching this closely, watch this appropriations process. Burgum is going to go before the authorizing committees in June. I think June 12th is the hearing in the House Natural Resources Committee. And I would say, watch these folks and see how much they start to engage on all of this and see if they start truly pushing back on the administration, because this will be how we judge them going into the next election. So I think the next couple of months are going to be very instructive in terms of whether or not Congress is going to push back or not.
Yeah. And for the listeners out there, I couldn't urge you enough to contact your congressional delegations and keep contacting them. Our congressman is Representative Blake Moore. Our two senators are Mike Lee and John Curtis. Mike Lee is fully on board with Project 2025. John Curtis won't respond. It's really interesting. The Congressman, Representative Moore, and Senator John Curtis have given up responding to constituent emails about what's going on in Washington. And so I can only urge listeners to this podcast to keep the pressure on your congressional delegations and try and get answers, because if we don't pressure them, we won't get answers and things will just go on down the road.
Look at Congresswoman Malloy. You know, we had thought during the budget reconciliation bill, which just happened, which is a totally separate thing from the appropriations bill, but during budget reconciliation, I had spoken with Republican staffers on the Hill. I thought that bill would be free and clear of any public land sell-off. And then at 11:30 at night, I'm watching from my home, not up on the Hill, this committee markup. And lo and behold, she offers an amendment to sell off hundreds of thousands of acres of public land. And we're all sitting there. It's 11:30 at night, and we're looking at these maps. And we see the 300-acre plot of land right on the border of Zion National Park. I mean, you know, after everyone had pretty much agreed there would be no land sell-off, anything in the budget reconciliation bill, your delegation, Kurt, the Utah delegation, decides that in the dark of night, we're going to try to sell off land in Nevada and Utah. And it was met with such anger and resistance. And
the Republicans passed it out.
Well, then it's being removed, but
but still.
But it's amazing to me how the Utah delegation is really this interesting body of people who are always testing whether or not you can get away with something.
Well, and it's really interesting. For those who don't know, Congresswoman Malloy is a Republican from Utah. She's not my Congresswoman. Blake Moore is, as I mentioned, my representative. But Utah is so invested in the Mighty Five, Arches, Bryce Canyon, Capitol Reef, Canyonlands, Zion National Park. They promote those parks incredibly. And to have a delegation turn their backs on the Park Service that brings so much money, economic activity to the state of Utah, is just boggling. You mentioned when we were talking about Alaska, the cuts to the inventory and monitoring team up there. What are you hearing across the country? I mean, we all know how important inventory and monitoring is. I mean, as you mentioned, it's one way to keep your finger on the pulse of the natural environment, the cultural environment, where are the invasive species, what is climate change doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any idea what's going on outside of Alaska in terms of inventory and monitoring for the Park Service?
We don't have a good handle on how many people have left. What we have heard have been drips and drabs. So, for instance, we heard that some of the monitoring of air quality, those contracts weren't getting renewed in a timely fashion. And this to me is just sort of like, it doesn't just hurt the parks, it hurts the country. Parks are supposed to have the best air quality in the entire country. And this monitoring that we do in national parks ensures that that is the case. And every community around those national parks benefits from the clean air that exists. And so we are just shooting ourselves in the foot when we are saying to the people who have direct experience and expertise in air monitoring and saying, we're not going to continue your contracts. Now, my understanding is that they've since reversed and they are moving forward with most of that air monitoring. But these are the kinds of things that jeopardize the health publicly across the board, not just in parks. And so we're worried about the air monitoring folks, we're worried about the water monitoring folks, we're worried about the people who are also looking at water quantity, not just quality, because we know the parks have seen ups and downs with our rivers and lakes, and there's so many communities that depend upon the fresh water from the rivers that flow through parks. So we continue to try to get our hands around how many people are gone from those programs, but it's just shooting ourselves in the foot long term by not having inventory and monitoring. It helps the entire country understand the quality and the health of our atmosphere and our water. And then the cultural resources folks who protect our history and who ensure that we're continuing to work with tribes. It's just, these are not things that when you cut them, you can go back and find experts instantly to work on this. Some of these people have long-term investments in these studies that help us all the time. And so this will be a huge problem if they get rid of the inventory and monitoring program, which we understand was on the list of things that they were going to entirely riff under the reduction in force. So it's to our detriment as a country if we allow this to happen.
Absolutely. These are issues that we can't just turn our back and forget about them. We've got a wonderful two-part series of stories on the Traveler. Part one just started running from Smoky's Life, the great group that supports Great Smoky Mountains National Park, on the Eastern Hellbender, the biggest salamander in the world, and they're hanging on. There's a petition to have them listed as a threatened or endangered species, I believe. But last year's hurricanes really damaged the watersheds that the hellbenders rely on, and who knows how many hellbenders we lost. But that's just one species. You could come up with dozens and dozens and dozens of species that it is so important to know how they are doing if you're concerned about natural resources, because not only is it the species that can be at risk, but why is a species at risk? In terms of the hellbender, it's water quality, as you mentioned earlier.
But it also, that's a great example of a park unit and species that people love to see this stuff. It's not just the grizzly bears people love to see when they go to the national parks. I think I've seen more cool critters, like little guys, in Olympic National Park than I have any other park unit. And it was only because my dear friend is a wildlife biologist and could point them out to me that we saw all kinds of snails and really cool stuff out there. And people want to have those experiences in national parks. They want to see these critters, and they also want them to thrive and see parks as the place where they can thrive. So if we stop caring about these ecosystems, and we don't manage for them and manage for these creatures, they go away. And it's funny because I feel like there's so much pride When people look back and they think about the bald eagle and some of these species that have recovered over time, it's like a point of pride in America that we restored these habitats to a point where we could bring back a species that was on the brink. That's not what this administration is doing. They're not setting us up for success when it comes to that. And so some species that we never thought could be on the brink could start moving in that direction because the administration is not only defunding the parks and getting rid of the experts who work to protect them, but then they want to drive all of this energy development, and they want to reinstate the God Squad, which is basically bypassing the Endangered Species Act in order to allow energy development. It's all just part of a larger plan that the administration has for less protection, less staff, less environmental protection, and more development. And we need to resist that.
Well, let me ask you, the argument is that the federal government is top heavy. I've gotten a lot of interesting emails from some readers out there who believe that. There's too many people in the Park Service. We don't need that many. Going back to Alaska, the regional office, I mean, they're downsizing. I mean, is it not possible to function with a reduced staff?
You have to ask yourself, what does that mean on a practical level, though, right? Like, do we really only care about visitor services? So we're not going to worry about maintenance. We're not going to worry about the sewer systems or the water treatment facilities in parks. We're not going to worry about wildlife protection and biology. We're not going to protect historical resources anymore. We're going to just let everything fly and be up to the winds, and we're just going to make sure that there's enough people to sit at the visitor center to hand you a map. That's just not how we've ever protected parks from the first park unit ever designated by Congress. Yellowstone was protected for many, many reasons, but one of which was to stop poaching. It was to protect that wildlife habitat so that that ecosystem could rebound and thrive. That was the intention with Yellowstone. Of course, all the historians are going to tell me all the beautiful Moran paintings that traveled through Congress and showed the geysers and how cool Yellowstone was and how people would want to go visit it. 100%. I am enthralled by all of that stuff when I go to Yellowstone myself. But let's remember just the basics over 150 years ago. We decided to protect 2.2 million acres of Yellowstone because we wanted a thriving ecosystem. And so that's the heart and soul of what the Park Service was going to provide the public. And that's why the park system has expanded to hundreds of units since then, is because that expectation is built into the park system itself.
We are heading for a collision course on so many different avenues. Hurricane season. I just got an email from one of the climate organizations saying that it's going to be a robust hurricane season this summer. We still have some parks trying to recover from last fall's hurricanes. I mean, everybody knows about the Blue Ridge Parkway and the North Carolina stretch that was torn in so many different places. But DeSoto National Memorial in Florida hasn't been open for a long time because of damage. And I'm just wondering, does the Park Service have the resources it needs to put these places back together and to deal with the upcoming hurricane season? I mean, we hear about, we've got, crews on standby to go to whichever park needs them. But when you've got parks, I mean, the Blue Ridge Parkway is an unusual case for sure, but DeSoto is a small unit and it still isn't fully up on its feet and running.
I don't think we can trust that this administration will address problems as they happen. I think everything is being swept under the rug, grants are being stopped. At some point, you're not going to be able to redeploy people from one place to another. You're just going to have such slim staff people that you can't move people around to help each other. So I think we may be in a situation where we have to wait out this administration in order to regain and rebuild the parks that have issues. But I think we could very much be in a moment in time where we allow certain parks to deteriorate because this administration just is not committed to helping them recover from storms or flooding, and are unwilling to staff the the parks in the right way, and we know they're holding up contracting all over the place, so forget about bringing in other people to help. So we could be in a situation where we could just be at a standstill in so many park units and not be able to get them the help that they need. But at this point, I just don't see these particular people who are running parks at a political level in DC. I do not believe that they have the know-how or the desire to try to help the parks if something does happen. They seem like they are just calling everything inefficient, and they don't see the value of these places and why we want to protect them. So I was actually hoping, Kurt, during these hearings last week, that Burgum would say something reassuring, that he would say, of course, I'm a governor. I want to take care of these places. People love to spend their weekends in places. People love their open spaces, and this is part of our culture as Americans or something. Give us some hope that you care about this. He talked about park units that are not NP parks. He called them cost centers. I think I told you this. I think you and I were talking on the phone, and I said, Kurt, I looked up what a cost center is on Google. And it's something that costs money but doesn't make money. Now, that's not the way that Americans think about our national parks. They think about them as, we are a great country. We have beautiful places. We have places that we want to preserve because of our history. And we are going to spend a little bit of money, it's not a lot of money, to preserve these places so that our kids and grandkids can enjoy them and learn from them. But to talk about them as though they're cost centers, it reduces my faith in the Secretary of Interior that he's capable of protecting these places. And yeah, if a storm blows through, he's going to let them rot. I mean, I just don't really expect seeing them rising to the challenge. And so, which amazes me in some ways because they seem so interested in America 250. The lion's share of park units that celebrate America's democracy and the Revolutionary War are not NP national parks. So do you love them or not? Tell me, because it's not obvious to me. And so, yeah, I just don't see anything motivating them to caring. But I will tell you this is kind of fascinating. So some of the listeners probably saw that President Trump wrote into an executive order that he wants Independence Hall spruced up for the America 250. So I like to think that I'm a good mom, and I chaperoned my daughter's school field trip to Independence Hall a couple of weeks ago. And I have never seen anything like this in all of the parks I've ever visited. And many of you know that I worked on getting the Great American Outdoors Act passed through Congress. It was a brutal, lobbying effort trying to get Congress to get behind this, because if folks remember, it was a divided Congress at the time, but we negotiated the bill and were able to get it out. So I've seen many of the maintenance projects going on in parks. I've been equating Independence Hall as a beehive. There were more Park Service staff people at Independence Hall than I've seen in any park unit at any time in my entire life. Pretty much every maintenance person on the East Coast is at Independence Hall right now. They were repairing stairs along the patio areas of Independence Hall. They were in Constitution Hall redoing the ceilings and the flooring. There were rangers coming out of every part of Independence Hall, maintenance workers, unreal. So of course, even though I was on my daughter's field trip, I'm a very curious person, so I stopped as many park rangers as I possibly could and asked, what are you working on? What are you doing? They said, this is the most incredible thing that they've ever seen. And they said, we are getting 200 years of grime off the walls of Independence Hall. It's pretty incredible to watch. But this was the one park unit that the president targeted for maintenance. And I would probably say it's getting the most attention of any other park unit in the system right now. I've never seen so many maintenance people with arrowheads on their sleeves. And so that, in a way, I thought, great, the president finds value in a national park unit and is investing all this time and energy in making sure it's beautiful as it possibly can be by next year. But it's just, one place. And it just shows how willing they are to sacrifice all the maintenance teams and all the other park units in order to spruce up one.
Yeah.
And so, as much as I want to be excited about Independence Hall getting fixed up, because I love that place and it's near and dear to my heart from being a kid, we can't sacrifice everywhere and then just work on the parks that either President Trump or Burgum like. We need to take care of the entire system. And so, I wish the amount of enthusiasm I saw at Independence Hall existed throughout the entire park system.
We're running out of time, but there is one more interesting subject I wanted to discuss with you, because it pretty much went viral when the Traveler wrote about this. This was Secretary Burgum's order to put signs across the federal land management properties of the national parks, the Bureau of Land Management places, the Fish and Wildlife Refuges, asking visitors to report any signage that they disagreed with in terms of being woke or disparaging Americans. A couple of interesting things about this. One was the order just applies to any signs put up since 2020, or in other words, since President Biden took office. One day, we had over 100,000 visitors to Traveler, 99% of them reading this story. I got some hate mail, I got some love mail. Somebody who struggled with the English language calling it a walk problem, not a woke problem, a walk problem. What do you guys think about this? Is it an effort to rewrite history, to clean up history, to erase some aspects of history? Those who are regular Traveler podcast listeners will know we talked about the attempt to erase LGBTQ individuals. What's going on with this signage concern of the secretaries?
So first, I just want to say, absolutely, it's intended to erase history, and it's intended to sanitize history and only talk about the beautiful landscapes of the Park Service, or however it's written, which is crazy because how many park units do we have that commemorate wars or battles or significant points in history with the civil rights fight or Japanese incarceration? So we intentionally created park units to tell the not so great stories of our country, and in fact, even sites of trauma like Emmett Till. And so it was very intentional that these places were protected to tell these, stories in this incredible history. So saying that you're going to put up a QR code and invite people to criticize signage because you don't like it or it's woke or whatever, it's just an attempt to sort of oddly crowdsource opinions about things when the Park Service has, I think, about 200 historians, or at least they did as of last year. We actually hire people at the Park Service who dig into history so they can accurately tell these stories. As you know, these administrative histories are written for each park unit, so you can actually go back to prehistoric history even to tell the story of a particular park unit. Opinions are fine. It's part of being an American and our First Amendment rights, but history is history. And that's why the Park Service has a mission to tell the history of each park unit accurately. And in 2016, I worked on a bill called the National Park Service Centennial Act that reinforced the Park Service's mission to tell stories accurately. And so as much as it's nice to get people's opinions about stuff, it's not what people go to parks for. It's people go to parks to actually learn about the history of these places. And I'll be fascinated to see how they crowdsource all of this and make decisions based on it. But I think for everyone who's listening to this podcast, please, as soon as these QR codes go up, please write 10 times a day to this QR code how much you love the parks and how you want history accurately accounted for in our parks. Do not let these folks make a case for this ridiculous exercise, which is exactly what it is. It's meant to just inflame the culture wars that some of these folks want to perpetuate. It's not meant to bring the country together or to, help us be better citizens. And so that's really disappointing. But I do want to share with you, I was talking to our regional director in the Mid-Atlantic today, and he reminded me that during the first Trump administration, there was an inventory of Confederate statues in parks. And the outgrowth of that was to put up signage in parks that told the story of those statues, to say they were put up by people who believed in the lost cause, who helped put in place Jim Crow laws. And so we at NPCA we had a lot of people mad at us because we said, you should leave the Confederate statues up, just interpret them so that people understand how they got there and why they're there, which is what I think was the result of something that started during the first Trump administration. So that's really what the Park Service should be doing, is looking at these sites and making sure the interpretation is on point, but not crowdsourcing opinions on whether or not, a sign bothers you or not. Traumatic history sucks. Like as a woman, it's not great that we just got voting rights in the early 1900s, but I want to understand why. And I've brought my kids to the suffrage sites of the park system so they can learn how their vote matters. And so it's not a pretty story of America, but it's one worth telling, and it's one worth ensuring that people have the accurate story about. And thankfully, we have great sites that do that. But sanitizing this or crowdsourcing just seems very strange to me when you have historians on staff.
Well, I'm curious as to whether anybody who visited Theodore Roosevelt National Park in Mr. Burgum's home state of North Dakota will comment about the scenic view sheds being cluttered by the flaring of gas wells or by oil pumps. You can see some of those at Canyonlands National Park as well. And of course, as you well know, Kristen, in Idaho, there's the ongoing battle over a wind farm that will be visible from Minidoka National Historic Site. And do those obscure scenic view sheds?
That's a great point. And again, if these QR codes show up, this is exactly the kind of stuff that our constituency, that the people who love our national parks should be telling them, that we need to get rid of all of that oil and gas development around Teddy Roosevelt. So absolutely, people should be talking about the view sheds that are being impaired right now due to some of this development that hurts the view shed of those parks. But I feel like parks are such a rallying point for our country. They're such a nonpartisan way that we all celebrate our country together. And I feel like all of these efforts are just intended to try to break people apart and sort of shatter the image of the Park Service, which is apolitical. And so I hope people don't engage with it. It's terrible, and we're better than this. And just to think that like our parks are completely understaffed right now, and they're already having a tough time this spring break and Memorial Day weekend and heading into we know from looking at Memorial Day this past weekend that this summer is going to be incredibly busy for the Park Service staff. And instead of worrying about that, we're going to put signs up with QR codes. It just shows how out of touch this administration is with the needs of this country.
Well, Kristen, thanks so much for joining me today. We covered a lot, but there's still a lot more to cover, and unfortunately, and we'll revisit that down the road. But thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. See you soon.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it helpful in terms of understanding the pressures the National Park Service is under. If you encounter any concerning issues in your travels through the National Park System this summer, please reach out to the Traveler to let us know. There's a Contact Us button on the lower right-hand side of nationalparkstraveler.org. For the Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.